Hi guys, and welcome to Anunnaki's Sanctuaries channel. Tonight we walk where the air tastes like river mud and baked clay, where lantern light slides across a room full of tablets stacked like sleepy bricks. You can almost hear the soft scratch of a reed stylus, the little hush-hush sound of wet clay taking a mark, as if the earth itself is learning how to remember. The title tonight is Before Egypt Began, a civilization mentioned only in Sumerian records, and we are going to treat it exactly the way a calm mind should treat big ancient puzzles. Some parts are widely accepted history, like who wrote the tablets and why they mattered. Some parts are interpretation, like what a strange place name might mean if you tilt it toward the Nile. And some parts are gentle, what-if imagination, cinematic, but clearly not a conclusion. You probably will not survive this, in the sense that you might fall asleep halfway through and wake up with a pillow crease that looks like cuneiform. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and your local time in the comments so we can picture this story drifting across your night. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step into a city that is not Egypt. Not yet. Not even close. And yet it already feels like a place where the world begins to keep receipts. The street is narrow, packed earth under your sandals, and the smell is a mix of smoke, damp reeds, and something like warm bread cooling in a basket. Most historians agree that in southern Mesopotamia, people build dense cities early, with temples that act like the beating heart of the neighborhood. Those temples are not only places for prayer, they are warehouses, offices, and sometimes, whether anyone admits it or not, the place where gossip gets recorded in the most boring way imaginable. You can gossip in poetry, or you can gossip in accounting, and the accounting version lasts longer. You find a doorway and duck inside, and suddenly the noise of the street drops into a muffled hum. The room is dim. Clay tablets sit on shelves, stacked in rows, some neat, some leaning like tired books. Your fingers want to touch everything because the surfaces look soft, like bread dough. But you remember these are hardened and ancient, and touching is a modern habit that no one invited. A scribe sits cross-legged, and the scribe's calm is almost rude. Imagine being so chill while inventing paperwork. What's broadly accepted is that scribes here develop ways to track grain, livestock, labor, deliveries, and temple offerings. A tablet might list how many jars of oil arrive from a village, or how many sheep leave for a festival. It is not romantic, and yet it is the beginning of a kind of magic. The magic is this: a city can tell the future when it writes the present down. If you know what you have, you can plan what you need. If you plan what you need, you can build what you want. And if you build what you want, you start to look like a civilization. Still, the room feels haunted. Not with ghosts, but with names. Place names. Personal names. Titles. Small words with heavy weight. You watch a scribe press the stylus into clay, making those wedge marks that look like little bird tracks. The scribe is not thinking about you. The scribe is thinking about quantities and destinations. 1 basket, 10 jars, so many measures of barley, delivered to the storehouse, received by the overseer, paid out to the work crew. It is steady, repetitive, and in that repetition, you catch something that does not fit. A careful reading might suggest that among the ordinary entries, certain tablets point outward, beyond the city walls, beyond the canals and farms, toward lands that are not Sumer. Not every tablet does this. Most are as thrilling as a grocery list. But even a grocery list becomes interesting if one item is impossible. If someone writes down, in the same tone as barley, something like stone from far away. Your imagination sits up in bed. You move closer to a tablet laid on a mat. Still damp, still fresh enough that the marks shine. This is not a myth. This is not a poem about gods punching each other in the sky. This is the administrative voice of a city, calm and dry, and that is why it can be so tempting to trust it. Yet this is where the truth ladder comes in, even in a quiet room with a fan humming somewhere in your mind. The fact that a place name exists on a tablet is documented. What that place name refers to is often interpreted. And when we picture the people behind it, the boats, the roads, the salt wind on their skin, that is imagined. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. There is a particular thrill in the idea that somewhere in these clay records, there is a mention of a civilization before Egypt began, a society on the Nile or near it, present enough to trade or be noticed, but absent from its own surviving texts. It's an emotional thought. It's also a risky one, because emotions love to grab the steering wheel. So you keep your hands light. You let the tablet speak in its own quiet way. You walk to another shelf where older tablets sit, their edges chipped, their surfaces worn smooth by time. Many are labels, tags for baskets and jars. Little notes that once hung on goods like ancient sticky notes. Some are lists of places, cataloging where things come from or where they go. Most historians agree that these lists can include real geographic regions, trading partners, and sometimes names that shift over generations. Scribes do not always use the same spelling. They write what they hear. And what they hear depends on who is talking. And who is talking depends on who is doing the traveling. One interpretation is that some of those outward-looking names could gesture toward the Nile world, even in periods when Egypt's later dynastic story has not yet fully formed in the archaeological record the way we recognize it. That does not automatically mean there was a single, lost super-kingdom waiting in the shadows. A more cautious explanation could be that these are small communities, ports or networks, remembered by Mesopotamian traders and reduced to a single label. It's possible that the name in the tablet is less a national flag and more a merchant's shorthand. But your brain, as always, wants to do the cinematic thing. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if a place name in a Sumerian list is a faint echo of a culture that built along the Nile before the famous dynasties? A culture that left objects, habits, maybe even designs, but whose own writing, if it existed, did not survive. What if the only reason we know it existed is that a bored scribe in Mesopotamia needed to log a shipment and wrote the destination down? You linger on the physicality of it all, the clay, the water, the kiln heat, the reeds, the smell of silt. You notice how the room is organized, because organization itself is a clue. A city that keeps records is a city that expects continuity. It expects tomorrow to look enough like today that the same systems will work. That expectation is a sign of confidence. It is also a sign that the city has contacts, networks, and dependencies. A temple cannot keep its lights on, metaphorically, without a steady stream of resources. Some of those resources are local. Some are not. Archaeology suggests that southern Mesopotamia lacks certain raw materials, like timber and stone. So long-distance exchange becomes important. That is widely accepted. You can feel it in the tablets, even without reading them perfectly. When a city needs stone and does not have stone, it either lives without stone or it finds friends. If you want to build impressive things, you need impressive materials. and impressive materials often come from far away. That makes a map of necessity, not just geography. Your mind drifts to waterways, because water is the ancient internet. Rivers connect people, and coastlines connect rivers, even when deserts loom. Water offers routes that feel almost like shortcuts. It's possible that Mesopotamian traders and travelers, over long stretches of time, encounter communities along the Arabian Gulf, the Red Sea, or routes that brush the edges of the Nile sphere. Yet when we imagine a direct line from Sumer to the Nile, we have to keep it gentle. Travel is not always direct, and names can travel faster than people. A name might move through 5 mouths before it reaches a scribe's clay. The scribe in the room shifts and sets aside a finished tablet. You catch a glimpse of the marks. You do not pretend to read them like a superhero. You're not going to stare at a squiggle and suddenly become fluent. Still, you can sense the structure, the pattern, numbers, determinatives, repeated symbols, the rhythm of record keeping, the calm authority of someone saying, "This happened, and I want it counted." This is where the tension lives tonight. Not in battles, not in swords, not in dramatic music. The tension is in a list. In the way a list suggests the world is bigger than the room. In the way a list hints that someone somewhere else matters enough to be written down. And that matters because Egypt, as we later know it, becomes one of the great story engines of the ancient world. Yet here, in this quiet Mesopotamian room, the world is not divided into famous and unfamous. It is divided into near and far, useful and not useful, known and not quite known. You find a tablet that seems to be a catalogue of places, a kind of mental map pressed into clay. The evidence we do have points to Sumerian scribes naming lands in ways that sometimes correspond to real regions, while other names remain debated. That's a polite way of saying, sometimes we know, sometimes we guess, and sometimes we shrug and go make tea. Historians still argue whether certain place names refer to specific locations, broad zones, or even mythic ideas that sound geographic but function like poetry. That debate is important because tonight's premise depends on it. If a name is unclear, it can become a mirror for whatever you want to see. So you keep the solid ground separate from the mist. On solid ground, you have early Sumerian urban life, temples as economic hubs, and writing used for administration. On misty ground, you have the interpretation that some outward names might connect to regions that later become linked with Egypt or its neighbors. And in the gentle imagination layer, you have the image of a civilization that exists like a shadow behind a candle, seen only because someone else's flame flickers at the right moment. You decide to follow the most sensible path first. If a civilization is mentioned only in Sumerian records, then maybe it is not a grand empire, but a trading partner whose own texts did not survive. Perhaps the Nile Delta, with its damp soils and changing river channels, eats and buries evidence. Perhaps early communities write on materials that rot, like wood or papyrus, and those writings vanish in the wet. Perhaps they do not write much at all yet, relying on memory, tokens, markings, or spoken agreements. Those are cautious possibilities. None of them require secret histories. They just require time, weather, and the simple unfairness of preservation. But you also let the mind have its slow, cinematic walk. You picture a small port community near a river mouth. Not necessarily grand, but organized. People unload goods. They weigh things. They stamp clay seals on the baskets. They speak a language that sounds like water and wind to foreign ears. A traveler from that place ends up in Mesopotamia, or a Mesopotamian trader hears of that place through intermediaries. The name changes as it travels. like a word whispered down a line of sleepy people. By the time it lands in the scribe's hands, it is not the original name anymore. It is a Sumerian approximation, a label, a sound pinned down. You imagine the scribe making a face, because even ancient accountants have opinions. The scribe asks, "How do you say it again?" The merchant repeats it, gesturing vaguely toward the west or the far south, and the scribe writes something that fits the mouth of cuneiform. The name is now clay. The name is now real, in the way writing makes things real. And the people who spoke the original name do not know they've been recorded. They are going about their lives, building with reeds and mud brick, living under a sky that does not care about dynasties yet. There's a small joke that floats in, gentle enough not to wake you up. Imagine being an ancient civilization and your only surviving appearance in history is as a line item, not a statue, not a hymn, not a heroic epic, just received goods from that place. It's like being remembered forever as guy who brought snacks. Honestly, relatable. You keep walking around the room and notice seals. Small carved stones used to stamp impressions into clay. The evidence we do have points to seals being crucial in early administration, and their designs can travel, carrying styles across regions. If a seal style shows up far from home, it might support the idea that people or goods moved long distances. This raises the possibility that connections existed earlier than we assume in casual storytelling. Still, it is suggestive, not conclusive. Styles can spread without mass migration, and objects can travel without their makers. In a corner, there is a basket of broken tablet fragments, bits that once held complete thoughts. This is where your heart does the little squeeze. Because fragments are honest. They tell you, you will not get the full story. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You pick up a fragment in your imagination, because in real life you would get politely escorted out. The fragment shows a few marks, maybe part of a name, maybe a number, maybe a determinative that indicates place, and that's all. It's like hearing one note of a song and trying to guess the whole melody. A fringe idea proposes that certain ancient records hide deliberate references to lost civilizations that later writers downplay or forget. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it lingers in popular imagination because it feels dramatic. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes more like a mood than a claim. The mainstream view is usually simpler. Records survive unevenly, names shift, and history is messy. Yet even simple explanations leave room for wonder. Because wonder is what fills in the silence between tablets. You step back and let the room breathe. The scribe's work continues. The fan in your real room continues too. If you took my earlier advice, and you realize something soothing, whether the before Egypt civilization is a major lost polity, a network of communities, or simply an ambiguous name, the story tonight begins with the same gentle truth. Humans are connected earlier than we sometimes imagine, and writing captures those connections in small, unglamorous ways. You do not need an exploding mystery to feel the weight of it. A list is enough, so you stand there, second person and quiet, as if you are part of the shadows between shelves. You watch the stylus press into clay again and again, and you let yourself hold a careful thought. It's possible that somewhere in these records, a civilization exists in the margins, not famous, not preserved in its own voice, but present enough to leave a trace. And what if a single damp tablet, forgotten under a collapsed wall, still waits in darkness to whisper its name? You step out of the dim record room and into a courtyard where the night air cools the clay smell on your skin. A shallow basin reflects starlight, and somewhere nearby, a donkey complains in the ancient language of, "Why is life like this?" which honestly has not changed much. The city keeps moving, even in the late hours, because temples do not sleep. Bread still gets baked, jars still get sealed, and someone is always counting something. Usually by the light of a small oil lamp that makes everyone's face look like they are auditioning for a very serious statue. Most historians agree that places like Uruk grow into huge urban centers early, with specialized labor and administration that reaches far beyond simple village life. When writing appears in this environment, it does not arrive as poetry first. It arrives as management. It arrives as someone needing to track who owes what, who delivered what, and who is trying to borrow barley with no intention of returning it. You can almost see the birth of bureaucracy, toddling around like a toddler with a clipboard. You follow a canal that glints like a dark ribbon. Boats are moored along the bank, long and shallow, their reed bundles tied tight. The people here know water the way you know shortcuts on your phone. Water is the shortcut. The canal network is a living system, controlled and maintained, feeding fields and moving goods. Archaeology suggests that irrigation and canal management are central to southern Mesopotamian life, and the evidence we do have points to organized labor being required to keep these systems working. That organization has a side effect. It trains people to think in networks. Not just one village, but many. Not just one field, but a whole web of fields connected to the temple storehouse. A merchant steps past you, carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He moves like someone who knows exactly where he is going. It is possible that he is a local trader. It is also possible he is part of something bigger, a chain of exchanges that stretches beyond the horizon. One interpretation is that the most powerful invention in the city is not writing, not the wheel, not even beer. Though beer is doing a lot of heavy lifting emotionally. The most powerful invention might be trust turned into procedure. You can trade with strangers if you have a system that records it. You drift toward the dockside where the smell changes. Here it is: fish, wet rope, and a faint tang of bitumen. That sticky black stuff used to waterproof boats. The practical details matter because they explain how stories travel. A boat that does not leak can carry more than cargo. It can carry gossip, words, and place names. A careful reading might suggest that the simplest tablets, the ones that look like dull accounting, can hold hints of surprising connections. A name appears in a list. A foreign material appears in a delivery note. A type of stone shows up that does not come from local ground. None of that automatically means a grand, hidden civilization. It does mean the world is wide, and the city knows it. You pass a small group of workers loading baskets onto a boat. Their voices bounce off the water. They speak in quick bursts, like short waves. Someone calls out a number, someone else repeats it, and a third person nods like a human stamp of approval. Most historians agree that standardized measures and repeated administrative routines help early states function, and that kind of standardization can spread. When a system works, people copy it, the same way you copy a cooking trick you saw once and then tell everyone you invented it. Your mind begins to trace a path. If Mesopotamia is writing things down, and if it is trading far, then it might encounter communities near the Nile world long before the classic royal images of Egypt feel fully formed. That is the interpretation lane, carefully marked. But the documented lane is this. Mesopotamia has early cities, early writing, and early long-distance exchange. That is broadly accepted. The puzzle enters when a tablet label points to a place that does not fit neatly into a map. You notice a small stack of goods waiting by the water, covered to keep off dust. There are lumps of resin, a bundle of wood, and something wrapped tightly that might be stone. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamia imported materials like timber, metal ores, and stones, and that long-distance exchange networks existed across the ancient Near East. You do not need to know every destination to feel the pull of it. When you watch goods move, you watch geography become real. A scribe sits on a low stool nearby, legs tucked, stylus ready. He is not in the temple now. He is here at the canal, which tells you something. Writing is leaving the inner sanctum of the administration and moving into the working world. He listens to the merchant speak, then presses marks into clay with the patience of a person who will never be impressed by your excuses. The scribe's face is calm, but his hands are fast. He writes the quantity, the type, the recipient, and then he pauses, just for a moment. When the merchant says the place name, that pause is everything. It is a tiny human moment inside a system that tries to be machine-like. A careful reading might suggest that unusual names cause that pause. Because unusual names require choices. How do you spell a sound you do not own? How do you fit foreign syllables into local signs? You can almost see him test the sound in his mouth, then decide on the closest set of marks. It's possible that this is how an entire civilization becomes mentioned only in Sumerian records. Not because it is secret, but because its name becomes a Sumerian version of itself, and its own voice does not survive on the materials that endure. You follow the boat as it pushes away from the bank. The water carries it, slow at first, then steady. The city falls behind into a blur of reed roofs and mud brick walls. Night insects begin their tiny orchestra, very committed, very loud, like they are trying to win an award. The boat moves through canals into broader waterways, and the air opens up. You begin to understand something that feels both mundane and enormous. Early civilizations are not isolated islands. They are braided rivers of contact, sometimes thin, sometimes thick, sometimes seasonal. Most historians agree that Uruk's influence extends widely, and scholars debate how that influence spreads, whether through trade, colonization, imitation, or a mixture depending on the place and time. Historians still argue whether early expansion is driven more by merchants seeking profit, or by institutions seeking control, or by communities copying what looks successful. That debate matters because if a distant region adopts certain administrative habits, it might be because people are moving, or because ideas are moving, or because objects carry habits with them. Your boat reaches a place where the water tastes more salty in the air, and the wind carries a different smell, sharper, like the edge of the sea. You're not naming exact destinations as certainties tonight. Some routes are known in broad strokes, others are reconstructed. But you can feel the logic. Water leads outward. Outward leads to exchange. Exchange leads to recorded names. A scribe on a riverbank may be the only witness to a distant society's existence, at least in what survives. Now the mystery creeps in softly, like fog that does not threaten you. A popular rumor claims that some early lists and labels hint at lands of astonishing antiquity, places that seem too organized too soon, as if something older is feeding them knowledge. This rumor is not widely accepted, and it often grows in the retelling. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a mood, not a claim. The mainstream view is usually more grounded. Distant contacts can feel sudden in the record because preservation is uneven and because writing captures moments, not continuous film. Still, you let the cinematic question hover. What if the name the merchant speaks is not just a place, but a memory of a culture along the Nile or near it, structured enough to be recognized, yet not preserved in its own durable writing? What if the first trace of that culture is not a monument, but a trade note, a receipt, the least glamorous immortality imaginable? Imagine being remembered as sent 2 jars, paid in copper. Your ancestors would be proud, or at least confused. The boat stops at a small way station. People unload, barter, rest. You hear different accents, and you realize that the ancient world is multilingual in the same way a modern port is. Words overlap, gestures translate when tongues fail. A careful reading might suggest that place names can shift dramatically in this environment. A name can be shortened, misheard, reinterpreted, and then written down as if it is stable. The evidence we do have points to ancient scribes using conventions to mark foreign names. But those conventions do not solve the problem of hearing. You watch a trader open a pouch and reveal small beads, bright even in lamplight. Someone else offers a polished stone. A third person brings out a seal, carved with an animal. The seal is pressed into a small lump of clay to mark ownership, and the impression looks like a tiny story. Archaeology suggests that seals are widespread tools of administration and identity. One interpretation is that when seal styles travel, they carry cultural fingerprints. This might support the idea that distant regions are connected earlier than a simple timeline would imply. But it is suggestive, not conclusive. Objects can travel without their makers, and styles can be copied without the original culture moving wholesale. A fringe idea proposes that an early teaching civilization existed somewhere between Mesopotamia and Egypt, passing along administrative concepts like seals and accounting, then vanishing from the record. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because it feels neat, like a missing puzzle piece shaped exactly the way you want. A more cautious explanation could be that similar solutions arise in different places because humans face similar problems. If you need to track goods, you invent tracking, whether or not a mysterious mentor shows up with a clipboard and a dramatic cape. The night deepens. The boat takes on fresh water and moves again. You stand near the bow and let the wind cool your face. You picture how easy it is for a single Sumerian tablet to preserve a name that otherwise disappears. In a wet delta, papyrus rots. In shifting river channels, settlements get buried. In a political upheaval, archives burn. In a flood, everything dissolves into mud. Meanwhile, a clay tablet baked by accident in a fire can survive thousands of years, stubborn and quiet. Like the universe's most durable sticky note, you arrive at a larger gathering place, a market that hums even late. Oil lamps dot the scene like warm stars. You see baskets of dates, bundles of reeds, jars of oil, and stacked goods wrapped for travel. The people move in practiced rhythms. This is not a fantasy realm. It is logistics with sandals, and in logistics, names matter. A scribe records arrivals again. A merchant speaks again. The scribe writes again. Somewhere in those repeated motions, a place name is preserved, and that is the hinge of tonight's theme. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian writing keeps track of people, goods, and places. One interpretation is that among those places, a few may correspond to regions connected to the Nile world earlier than later narratives suggest. And in the gentle imagination layer, you picture a quiet, Nile-adjacent civilization, real enough to trade, organized enough to be noticed, but lost enough that its voice reaches you only through someone else's inkless clay. You let the scene soften. The market sounds become less sharp. The lamplight becomes rounder. Even the donkey seems to quiet down, as if it has finally accepted its job description. You take one last look at the scribe's tablet, still damp, the marks catching the light. You do not claim certainty. You do not declare a hidden truth. You simply hold the clue like a warm stone in your palm, and you walk onward through the night, following the idea that sometimes history is not a trumpet. Sometimes it is a whisper written beside a number. You find yourself in a quieter corner of the city where sound feels padded, as if the walls are made of mud brick and secrets. A narrow stair leads up to a small room above a courtyard, and inside, the air is warm with lamp smoke and the faint, dusty sweetness of dried reeds. On the floor sits a wooden chest with a lid that creaks like it is trying to complain politely. Someone opens it, and you see more tablets. Not the day-to-day lists of barley and oil, but something with a different flavor. These tablets feel like memory work. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamian scribes do more than track goods. They also preserve traditions about rulers, cities, and legitimacy. When a society grows complex, it starts caring about who is allowed to be in charge. And the fastest way to argue about that is to write a list. A list of kings is not just history. It is politics in clay. It is the official version of, we have always been like this. Even if yesterday was chaotic and everyone knows it. You kneel beside a tablet laid out carefully, as if it deserves respect. The marks are arranged in a way that looks more narrative than numerical. Names appear. Titles appear. Reign lengths appear. Sometimes tidy, sometimes unsettling. You can almost feel the scribe's mind balancing two needs at once. One need is to preserve tradition. The other is to make tradition look smooth, as if the world has always obeyed a schedule. The evidence we do have points to king lists being compiled and copied over time, shaped by the concerns of the scribes and the courts that sponsor them. That part is documented in the sense that the lists exist and scholars can compare versions. But interpretation begins when you ask what the lists are trying to do. One interpretation is that king lists mix older memories with ideological editing, and that the edits can leave seams. Those seams are where your attention settles, because seams are where the cloth of history stretches. You notice how some rulers have reigns that seem long enough to make you raise an eyebrow. Not a horror eyebrow, just a sleepy, eyebrow. In some traditions, reigns are incredibly lengthy, almost mythic. A careful reading might suggest that such numbers serve symbolic purposes, or compress whole eras into one name, or preserve a memory of a time that feels distant and enormous to the scribes. A more cautious explanation could be that the numbers come through copying errors, changes in counting systems, or even deliberate exaggeration for prestige. People have always padded resumes. Ancient kings simply had better stationery. And then you notice something subtler. Some entries feel oddly thin. A name appears without much detail. A title appears that feels strange, or the narrative jumps, and you are left staring at a blank space in your own mind where you expected a bridge. This is where the fog rolls in, softly, without drama. Because gaps do not shout. Gaps whisper. You trace a line with your eyes, and you feel that old human urge to fill in missing pieces. This is a good moment to use the truth ladder gently. The existence of gaps and inconsistencies is documented. The reason for them is interpreted. The story you imagine inside them is cinematic possibility. Some parts are documented. Some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Now a different tablet appears, one that looks like it belongs to a scribe who likes to organize the world into categories. There are references to cities, rulers, and something like a transfer of authority. Not just this person ruled, but kingship moved. That idea alone is fascinating, because it treats power like a physical object you can carry from one city to another. like a ceremonial chair that everyone is too polite to admit is just a chair. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian political landscapes shift between city-states, with power waxing and waning over time. So the concept of kingship moving is not random. It is a stylized way to narrate real changes. Yet the stylization matters. The scribe is turning messy politics into a clean procession. One interpretation is that when the list becomes too clean, it can accidentally preserve hints of what it is trying to smooth over. A sudden change, an unusual title, a ruler described in a way that feels like a label pasted over uncertainty. That is where tonight's premise can nest without pretending it is fact. If a civilization is mentioned only in Sumerian records, it might appear as a shadow inside these transitions, not as a proud, self-described kingdom, but as an outsider influence that the list tries to digest. You lean in and notice certain epithets, the little descriptive tags that attach to names. Sometimes a ruler is tied to a city. Sometimes a ruler is tied to a lineage. Sometimes the description feels almost like a warning sign. Foreign, strange, not from here. You do not force the tablet to say more than it does. Still, you let the possibility breathe. It's possible that in times of upheaval, outsiders enter the story, whether as allies, traders, mercenaries, diplomats, or simply as people who show up when the door's left open. And you remember how names work. Names are slippery. A foreign group can be labeled with a local term. A distant land can be turned into a single sign. The scribes may be doing their best, but their best is still filtered through language and politics. This is the moment you hear the debate phrase, like a bell rung softly in a room full of clay. Historians still argue whether king lists are primarily historical records that happen to include ideology, or ideological documents that happen to include history. That argument is not a battle. It is a careful sorting problem. If you treat the lists as pure history, you risk believing propaganda. If you treat them as pure propaganda, you risk throwing away real memory. The middle path is calmer. The lists are memory shaped into meaning. You shift your attention from rulers to time itself. Time is the quiet villain of every ancient story. The further back you go, the more the timeline starts to blur. People tend to imagine history as a straight hallway with labeled doors. In reality, it is more like a room full of curtains, and you keep bumping into the furniture. Archaeology suggests that the rise of complex societies happens in overlapping ways across regions, not in a single, clean sequence. That means Mesopotamian records can contain names and hints that do not line up neatly with how later cultures, including Egypt, tell their own beginnings. Most historians agree that early Egypt, especially pre-dynastic communities and the formation of dynastic rule, is reconstructed through archaeology, later textual traditions, and comparative study. Yet those reconstructions have uncertainties, especially at the margins where local variation and sparse evidence make confident statements risky. This is where interpretation steps in. One interpretation is that Mesopotamian scribes might register contacts with Nile-adjacent communities at points when those communities are not yet visible in durable writing that survives. That does not require a vanished empire. It could be small polities, port towns, elite network, or traveling specialists. But the idea becomes tantalizing because of asymmetry. Clay survives well. Papyrus does not, especially in damp environments. If a community writes on the perishable materials, it can vanish from the written record even if it is real and organized. You sit back and let the lamplight soften. This is the kind of puzzle that can tempt you into dramatic certainty. But tonight, you keep your language gentle. This might support the idea that a only in Sumer civilization is not a fantasy, but a preservation artifact. a real contact preserved in one region's durable medium while the other region's voice fades. That is suggestive, not conclusive. A scribe nearby begins to recite names under his breath as he copies them. Like a lullaby made of syllables and power, you listen, and you realize something slightly funny. This is ancient content moderation. The scribe is deciding what is allowed to be remembered. If you ever feel overwhelmed by modern algorithms, just know that someone in a mud brick room invented the first recommended kings list and called it tradition. You lean toward another tablet, one that seems to handle not kings, but events. Floods appear in some traditions, and a great dividing line appears in certain narratives, separating one era from another. What's broadly accepted is that floods occur in Mesopotamian river systems and that flood stories become central in mythic and semi-historical narratives. But here, caution is essential. A flood story can reflect real disasters, but it can also become a symbolic reset button. A careful reading might suggest that flood motifs help scribes explain discontinuity, making messy breaks in memory feel like a single dramatic event. This is where a fringe idea often slips into the room wearing a dramatic cloak. A popular rumor claims that certain discontinuities in king lists and flood narratives hide references to lost civilizations, wiped away, leaving only faint mentions. This rumor is not widely accepted, and it tends to inflate with each retelling. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a prompt for careful thinking. The mainstream explanation is usually steadier. Floods, political shifts, and the fragility of archives can create breaks in the record without requiring a single catastrophic mystery. Still, you allow the cinematic question to hover in the lamplight. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the breaks and odd titles hint at contacts with a society to the west or southwest, near the Nile, whose own texts either do not survive or have not been found? What if a scribe, trying to keep the list orderly, leaves a strange epithet that is the only surviving wink toward that contact? You focus on the practical mechanics of how such a hint could appear. Imagine an elite marriage alliance. Imagine a trade agreement. Imagine a specialist craftsman arriving with techniques that feel novel, like seal carving styles or luxury object designs. None of those require conquest or fantasy. They require people moving, which humans do constantly, especially when water and trade routes make it possible. The list might record a ruler whose legitimacy depends on an outside connection, or a ruler whose origin is complicated. And the simplest way to handle complicated origin is to label it with a short description and move on. You smile to yourself because you know this impulse. If you have ever tried to explain a complicated family tree at a holiday dinner, you know exactly why a scribe would prefer a neat label. Now you step closer to a tablet with a cluster of city names. Some appear familiar in a Mesopotamian sense. Others feel less secure. The evidence we do have points to certain place names being hard to match with specific geography, especially when names shift and texts are copied. A careful reading might suggest that some ambiguous names could refer to regions on trade routes that eventually connect toward the Red Sea, or other corridors that could, indirectly, touch the Nile world. Yet you do not pin a flag on a map and call it solved. You keep it calm. You keep it honest. The room grows quieter as the night deepens. Copying continues, slow and steady. A small insect lands on a tablet and walks across the wet clay, leaving a faint track. It is the tiniest act of vandalism in history. Somewhere. An ancient scribe sighs in a way that transcends time. You have to laugh softly at that, because it means the past is not a museum. It is a workplace, and workplaces have annoyances. You let your mind settle on the core feeling of this section, timekeeping. king lists, and the urge to make power look continuous can all create spaces where outsiders appear only as faint descriptors. That is the mainstream anchor, plus the interpretation angle. And the gentle imagination layer is the image of a lost Nile-adjacent society, peeking through those descriptors like a face seen briefly through a doorway. You are not proving anything tonight. You are following clues. You hold the solid ground separate from the mist. On solid ground, scribes compile lists that mix memory and ideology. On misty ground, those lists may preserve hints of complicated contacts. In the cinematic layer, you picture a civilization that does not speak to you in its own surviving texts, yet still touches the edges of these Mesopotamian narratives. The lamp flame wavers once, then steadies. The tablet under your gaze looks patient, as if it has been waiting a very long time for someone to notice its small oddities without turning them into a loud myth. You exhale slowly, and you let the quiet do its work. You travel at night because the desert is less bossy after sunset. The heat loosens its grip, and the sand stops feeling like it wants to argue with your ankles. The sky above you is clear enough to make you feel small in a comforting way, like the universe is saying, "Relax, you are not in charge." The thin crescent moon hangs there, and the stars look pinned into place with quiet confidence. Most historians agree that long-distance exchange in the ancient Near East relies on a mix of waterways and overland routes, and that merchants, porters, and local middlemen stitch regions together without needing a single grand empire to supervise it all. The evidence we do have points to practical needs driving these routes, because Mesopotamia is rich in mud and ideas, but not always rich in stone, metal ores, or timber. When a city wants copper, it finds copper. When it wants lapis, it finds lapis. When it wants good wood, it starts learning the names of distant trees the way you learn the name of a restaurant that delivers late. You stand at the edge of a canal that opens toward broader water, and the air smells faintly briny. Boats rest low in the water, their sides dark with waterproofing. The hulls look simple, but you can tell how much knowledge sits inside that simplicity. A boat is a promise that you can move more than your own body. A boat is a sentence that says, "I will return," even if nobody guarantees it. Archaeology suggests that people in this world learn to handle water routes with real skill, using river currents, tides, and seasonal winds. They do not have modern maps. They have memory, landmarks, and stories. One interpretation is that a hidden corridor in this era is not a single road you can point to, but a shifting set of options that open and close with the seasons. A shallow channel becomes passable after rains. A marsh becomes a pathway when water levels change. A coastal hop becomes safer when winds turn friendly. You step onto a boat and feel it sway, and your body does that little wobble that says, "I have forgotten I am not part fish." The boatman does not even look at you. He has the calm of someone who has watched 1,000 nervous passengers do the same dance. The boat slides away from shore, and the city lights become a loose constellation behind you. As you move, you hear the cargo shift. Baskets creak, jars click. Goods have their own language, a language of weight. The boat carries more than materials. It carries names, spoken softly between traders, passed along like a carefully wrapped object. A careful reading might suggest that the place names appearing in Sumerian records could travel exactly like this, moving along routes that are practical first and romantic only later. Now the land changes. The water narrows, then widens, then narrows again. Reeds crowd the edges. The moonlight paints the tops silver. Somewhere in the reeds, something splashes, and you decide it is a fish, because that is the calmest option. If you insist it is a sea monster, you will not sleep, and this is supposed to be bedtime history. not bedtime panic. The boat reaches a point where water becomes less reliable, and people begin to unload. Here is the hinge between two worlds. Water to land, boat to foot. Cargo becomes burdens. Burdens become wages. Wages become tablets. A line of men forms, each taking a share of the load, and you follow the movement inland. Most historians agree that caravans are a major part of ancient trade, especially where rivers do not go. Donkeys and onagers carry loads across hard ground. People travel in groups for safety, because even in the ancient world, going alone is often just another way to say becoming a cautionary tale. The evidence we do have points to established way stations and watering points being crucial, and that means certain paths get used repeatedly. Repetition turns paths into routes. Routes turn into names. The caravan leader is a practical type. He checks straps, counts bundles, and gives instructions in a voice that suggests he has no interest in anyone's personal growth journey. You admire that. Sometimes history advances because someone is extremely organized and slightly impatient. You walk with them, and your feet find a rhythm. The night air smells like dust and faint vegetation crushed underfoot. Ahead, the horizon is a darker line where the desert meets the sky. The caravan moves toward that line, and you realize how easy it is for a route to feel like a secret when it is actually just a habit. One interpretation is that the hidden corridor connecting Mesopotamian knowledge with regions closer to the Nile could be made of these habits. A chain of short jumps rather than one dramatic expedition. A merchant might travel only as far as the next hub, then hand off goods to another merchant, who travels further, and so on. Names move with goods. Stories move with names. By the time a Sumerian scribe writes a foreign place into clay, that place may be several voices removed from the original speaker. The mystery feeling comes in when you consider what happens to a society that sits along one of these corridors. It might be real, organized, and influential in a local sense, but still appear in writing only through the eyes of outsiders, if its own records are written on perishable material, or kept in places that later get flooded or buried. Its written voice might disappear. A Sumerian tablet could become the accidental survivor, the last person at the party, holding the group photo. The caravan reaches a small encampment, a scattering of shelters and a fire kept low. The smell of warm milk and smoke drifts toward you. People squat in circles, murmuring, chewing, sipping. Someone offers you a drink that tastes like the idea of a goat rather than the goat itself. You accept because refusing hospitality in an ancient camp feels like tempting fate. And also because you are tired. Here, you hear talk of routes that change. A wadi that runs with water only after rain. A shallow channel that appears for a few weeks each year. A place where the sand hardens enough to cross. Archaeology suggests that climate and environment shifts can alter travel corridors, sometimes dramatically, over centuries and even shorter spans. So the map is not stable. The corridor itself is seasonal, almost alive. A careful reading might suggest that some ancient place names could refer not to a fixed city, but to a region defined by these seasonal openings. That makes interpretation tricky. If a Sumerian text mentions a land by name, it might be naming a zone of exchange rather than a single point on a map. The evidence we do have points to ancient scribes often using names in flexible ways, sometimes for a polity, sometimes for a region, sometimes for a trading network. Now let the cinematic layer drift in gently. What if there is a stretch of land, somewhere along these shifting corridors, where a community grows skilled at connecting worlds? A bridge society. They might control a watering point, a portage, a narrow pass, or a safe anchorage. They might develop distinctive seals, distinctive jar shapes, a distinctive way of measuring goods. They become known to traders. They become a name worth writing down. And then, because environments shift, the corridor changes, and the community's importance fades. Their place gets swallowed by silt, sand, or time. Their own records, if they exist, do not survive. The Sumerian mention remains. Like a footprint in clay, you keep your tone careful. That is a possibility, not a certainty. The mainstream explanation could be simpler. The Sumerian name might refer to a known region whose identification is debated, or to multiple places over time, or to a name that scribes use for convenience. Still, it is possible that a real, locally significant society hides behind that label. Not hidden on purpose, just hidden by preservation. The caravan sets off again, and you move through terrain that changes from open sand to rocky ground. Your feet find stones. The air cools more. You hear the soft clink of cargo and the occasional sigh of an animal who clearly did not sign up for long-distance logistics. Here comes one of those small human moments that keeps you awake in a friendly way. A merchant argues with the caravan leader about weight. The merchant insists his bundle is light. The leader lifts it, stares, and makes a face that says, "Light according to what philosophy?" They negotiate, they settle. Everyone moves on. It is ancient trade in its purest form. Someone always thinks their package is lighter than it is. Some truths are eternal. As the night continues, you notice that the people traveling know many names, but they treat those names differently. Some names are firm, like a city you can point to. Some names are soft, like a direction, like beyond the salt wind, like where the river splits. One interpretation is that when these soft names reach a scribe, the scribe hardens them into something that looks solid. Clay does that. Clay makes vague things look official. Historians still argue whether the most important driver of early, long-distance contact is direct journeys between major centers, or chains of intermediary exchanges that rarely require any one person to travel the full distance. That debate shapes how you imagine the corridor. If contact is mostly direct, you picture bold voyages and long caravans with clear destinations. If contact is mostly intermediary, you picture countless short links, each practical, each local, building a network that no one fully sees. Either way, a name can travel farther than a person. You reach a coastal edge, not necessarily a grand seaport, more like a working shoreline where boats come and go. The water here breathes in and out, and the air tastes salty. People speak in different rhythms. The cargo shifts hands again. Some bundles move on to boats, some stay on land. The corridor branches like a river delta of decisions. Archaeology suggests that maritime travel along coasts, combined with overland portage, can connect regions that seem far on a straight map. One interpretation is that this mix could form a plausible path toward the Red Sea sphere, which in turn offers connections toward northeastern Africa. Depending on time, technology, and local partnerships, you do not claim that any one Sumerian scribe is thinking, "Hello, Nile." You claim something calmer. Water and coastlines make long-distance contact possible. Impossible contact is enough to let names enter records. Here is the mystery portion, carefully labeled. A fringe idea proposes that an early corridor community might have served as a kind of cultural relay, passing along motifs, measurements, or administrative habits, then vanishing. This theory is not widely accepted, and the evidence is often thin. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a way to ask better questions. Why do certain object styles appear in distant places? Why do some measurements look similar? Why do some names appear in one archive but not another? A more cautious explanation could be parallel development and selective preservation, humans facing similar problems, like storing grain, sealing jars, and verifying deliveries, can invent similar solutions, and preservation can make one region look louder than another. Clay survives, wood rots, papyrus decays, wet environments swallow evidence, dry environments preserve it, but only where people happen to store things. You watch a sailor tie a knot with quick confidence, and you realize knots are another kind of writing, a physical memory of tension and direction. The ancient world is full of this, ways of recording information without letters. That matters because a society could be sophisticated without leaving the kind of writing that survives. It could still trade, still organize, still build, and yet be mostly silent in the long record. Silence does not equal absence. Sometimes it equals fragile materials. The night grows later. A small lamp flickers on a boat, and the flame trembles in the breeze. The sailor shields it with his hands. Patient, practiced. Your mind rests on that image, because it feels like the whole theme, a little light in a lot of darkness. A name held steady long enough to be written down. You step onto a boat again, and it glides away from shore. The coastline becomes a dark curve. The water is calm enough that the boat seems to float on oil. You listen to the soft slap of waves against the hull, a sound that could put anyone to sleep if they were not also thinking about ancient logistics. You let the thoughts stay gentle. What's broadly accepted is that long-distance exchange networks exist early and are shaped by environment, need, and human ingenuity. One interpretation is that the shifting, seasonal nature of corridors can hide communities that matter greatly in their own time but leave few durable traces. And in the calm, what-if imagination layer, you picture a Nile-adjacent or Nile-leaning society that appears in Sumerian clay as a name tied to goods, a quiet witness to contact, then disappears into the landscape that created it. A last-light joke drifts in, soft enough not to jolt you. Imagine being an ancient trader and your whole business model is, I know where the water is. That is basically the original version of owning the best Wi-Fi password. People will follow you anywhere. The boat continues. The stars continue. The world continues doing what it has always done, moving goods, moving words, moving memories. You breathe slowly and let the corridor remain what it truly is tonight. Not a solved route, not a bold claim, but a plausible pathway where names can cross deserts and seas and end up pressed into clay. You stand at the edge of a scribal workshop where the air is dry enough to make your lips feel like parchment, and the lamp smoke curls upward as if it is trying to write its own message on the ceiling. A tray of soft clay sits nearby, and a bowl of water glints like a tiny moon. The scribe in front of you is doing something that seems simple, almost casual, but it is quietly powerful. He is naming the world. Most historians agree that Sumerian records contain place names for distant lands, often tied to trade, raw materials, and the movement of goods. Some of these names become famous in modern discussions because they are both present and slippery. They show up, they matter, and yet their precise locations can be debated. Archaeology suggests that long-distance exchange brings copper, stones, woods, and luxury goods into Mesopotamia. And the evidence we do have points to scribes tracking these arrivals with careful consistency. Still, the names connected to those goods do not always sit still. You watch the scribe press wedges into clay, and you realize how physical naming is. Each sign is a choice. Each choice is a little act of translation. A careful reading might suggest that when scribes write foreign names, they are capturing sounds filtered through accents, intermediaries, and personal habits. The scribe is not holding a modern atlas. He is holding a moment in a conversation. Someone says a name, someone repeats it, someone shortens it, someone mishears it, and then the stylus makes it look permanent. Now you hear one of the famous shifting names spoken in the room, a name that feels like it has sea spray on it. Another name follows, heavier, like metal. Then another, exotic and far, like the idea of a horizon you never reach. You do not need to pin them to exact coordinates tonight to feel the bigger point. These labels operate like ancient categories. They can mean a place, a region, a network, or even a role in the trade system. One interpretation is that these names function like a merchant's mental map, less about borders and more about what you can get there and how you get it. A porter walks in carrying a basket sealed with a lump of clay. The seal impression is crisp, showing an animal and a patterned border. Someone checks it, nods, and the basket moves onward. The record will mention the seal, the goods, and the place. Yet what does the place mean? Exactly. Does it mean the port where the basket was loaded? Does it mean the region where the raw material was mined? Does it mean the community that handled the transaction? Or does it mean a broader trading zone that includes multiple steps? A more cautious explanation could be that the name is a convenient shorthand for a supply chain. You step closer to a tablet being drafted and see repeated symbols that look like a label attached to different lists. The scribe is consistent in his own way, but you can sense that consistency has to wrestle with a messy world. Merchants travel, dialects vary, routes shift, names drift. Here is a calm, mainstream anchor you can stand on. Most historians agree that Sumerian city-states engage in wide trade networks and that some of the named regions in texts can be linked, at least broadly, to areas known for particular resources. That is the solid ground. The mist begins when you ask which specific coastline or valley each name points to across different centuries and different texts. This is where scholars continue to debate and where your bedtime brain can enjoy the mystery without claiming certainty. Now the story becomes tactile. A trader brings in copper ingots that catch the lamplight with a dull gleam. Another brings stone beads, cool and smooth. A third brings a lump of resin that smells sharp and sweet. The scribe writes the same place name for multiple items, and you wonder if the name is a port that handles many goods, or a region that is known for a variety of exports, or simply the last stop the merchant remembers clearly. One interpretation is that the place name is sometimes the location of transaction rather than origin. In a world of intermediaries, origin can be a story, and transaction is a fact. You turn your attention to how people in the room say the names aloud. You notice small differences. One person stretches a vowel, another clips it. Someone else uses a different ending, like they learned the name from a different trading partner. The scribe keeps writing, turning this chorus of variation into one standardized form. A careful reading might suggest that this is where drift begins. A name can fossilize in writing even as it stays fluid in speech. A soft joke slips in as you watch the process. Imagine telling a scribe your hometown, and he spells it the way he feels in his heart. And then that version becomes history. That is basically ancient autocorrect, but with more clay and fewer apologies. You move to a shelf where tablets are stored by category. Some are accounts, some are ration lists, some are inventories. Then you see a cluster that feels different, more like learned exercises, like scribes practicing lists of places and things. These lists matter because they show that naming is not just practical, it is educational. Scribes train by memorizing the world in columns. River, city, mountain, foreign land, commodity. This is how an administrative mind expands beyond the horizon without leaving the room. Archaeology suggests that scribal schools exist and that training involves copying and memorizing standardized lists. The evidence we do have points to a culture of learning where repetition is a tool of stability. Yet repetition can also preserve old labels even after the world changes. A city might keep using a name for a trade zone long after the main port shifts, because the name is embedded in the system. One interpretation is that some names become brand names rather than precise addresses. Now let the mystery portion rise gently. If a civilization near the Nile, or near routes that brush northeastern Africa, is mentioned only in Sumerian records, it might appear through a name that is not unique. It might be folded into one of these shifting labels, like a smaller fish swimming inside a larger school. You might never see it labeled as itself. You might see it labeled as part of a trade region, a supply chain hub, or a category of foreignness that scribes understand in their own terms. This is not a claim of a hidden truth. It is a puzzle about language. The mystery is not in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. A new tablet is brought out, and the scribe begins to copy a list of lands. The sequence feels like a tour of the edges of their world. The scribe writes a name associated with islands and sweet water, then a name associated with copper and rugged landscapes, then a name that sounds distant and heavy with mystery. You notice how these names are often attached to particular kinds of goods in the record. That attachment is useful, but it can also mislead. If a name is linked with copper, you might assume that name is the mine, but copper could be traded through multiple hands. The label could point to the merchant hub, not the source. Historians still argue whether these famous toponyms refer to specific, fixed geographic locations or to shifting commercial spheres that change with time and context. That debate is not academic noise. It is the core challenge of reading these records as maps. If the names are spheres, then a single name can include multiple communities, including ones closer to the Nile world, even if those communities never appear as separate entries. You watch the scribe pause at one name, as if he is considering the best spelling. That pause feels like a doorway. A careful reading might suggest that variation in spelling and determinatives can hint that a name is not fully understood, even by the scribes. If scribes are uncertain, it increases the chance that the label is broader, older, or borrowed. Uncertainty is not failure. It is an honest sign of the limits of contact. A more cautious explanation could be that the scribes are simply copying traditional forms without fresh knowledge, or that local scribal conventions differ. The same land can be written in slightly different ways in different cities. The evidence we do have points to regional scribal habits, and that alone can produce variation. Still, variation is where interpretation lives. You decide to listen to the merchants rather than the scribes for a moment. Merchants speak in routes. One says the journey takes so many days by boat, then so many by donkey. Another says the winds were kind this season. A third mentions a place where water is sweet and rest is possible. These are sensory descriptions, not coordinates. Yet the scribe will translate all of this into one word on clay. This is how the world becomes both knowable and simplified. Now the cinematic layer arrives, slow and dreamy. What if one of these broad names sometimes includes a coastal community that sits at the edge of the Nile sphere? A place that does not think of itself as Egypt yet, but still has its own rituals, its own leaders, its own trade habits. What if its people send goods outward through intermediaries, and their identity gets bundled into a larger label used by distant scribes? In the record, They become a shadow inside a name. You are not proving anything tonight. You are following clues. A fringe idea proposes that some of these shifting names are intentional screens, like a code to hide sensitive trade sources. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it is a fun thought to hold lightly. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a question about incentives. Would merchants hide sources to protect profit? Possibly. Would scribes cooperate in that secrecy? Less clear. A more cautious explanation could be that ambiguity is simply a byproduct of distance and language. People do not need conspiracies to misunderstand each other. Misunderstanding is free and widely available. You notice something else? Sometimes the texts describe foreign people, not just by place, but by their role. A foreign craftsman, a foreign sailor, a foreign interpreter. The label might be a place name functioning like an adjective. This can blur identity further. One interpretation is that when the record says a person is from a named land, it could mean they originate there, or they traveled through there, or they belong to a trading group associated with that land. The record is not always a biography. It is often an administrative tag. A second soft joke slips in. Being labeled by an ancient scribe is like being labeled by a group chat. You become the guy with the boat for the rest of eternity. Whether you like it or not, you take a moment to focus on the physical tablet again. The clay is cool now. Drying, the marks are sharp. This is the medium that lasts. That fact alone can create an illusion. If you have Sumerian clay tablets naming a place, but you do not have comparable surviving records from the place itself, the place can feel like it exists only in Sumerian imagination. Yet it may have had its own ways of recording and remembering that simply did not preserve. A more cautious explanation could be that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when preservation conditions differ drastically. The workshop grows quieter. Someone extinguishes a lamp, and the room dims. The scribe finishes his line, then sets the tablet aside. In that moment, you see how easy it is for a name to outlive a city. A name can survive in archives, copied and recopied, long after the physical place changes, relocates, or disappears beneath silt. Your mind rests on the gentle premise. A civilization mentioned only in Sumerian records could be real, local, and active, but folded into a shifting label that scribes use for foreign trade zones. That is an interpretation, not a conclusion. The documented anchor is the existence of the records and the trade networks. The imagined layer is the face of the coastal traders, speaking their own name into the wind, unaware that somewhere far away, a scribe is pressing that sound into clay. A final light joke drifts in as you imagine the ancient logistics chain. Somewhere, a person has to invent the first "Where is my shipment?" complaint. It probably sounds like, "I sent you copper, you sent me silence," which is basically modern customer service but with fewer emojis. You breathe slowly. The naming continues, steady and human. Names do not sit still because the world does not sit still. Roots shift, tongues change, archives survive unevenly. And in that constant motion, a small civilization can vanish from its own written legacy while still leaving a trace in someone else's careful lists. You let that thought settle like dust in lamplight. Calm and unresolved, exactly the way a bedtime mystery should be. You enter a temple courtyard just before dawn, when the sky is still dark but beginning to thin at the edges. The air smells like incense, damp clay, and the faint sweetness of dates. A bell chimes softly. Not the dramatic kind, more like a polite reminder that the gods are on a schedule. People move in practiced patterns, carrying baskets, jars, and bundles. No one rushes, But nothing stops. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian temples function as major economic institutions, tracking offerings, distributing rations, and coordinating labor. The evidence we do have points to temple administrators treating offerings with the seriousness of a modern warehouse manager who has learned the hard way that "we will remember later" is a lie. Offerings are counted, recorded, stored, and redistributed. In this world, devotion and logistics share the same shelf. You slip into a side room where a scribe sits beside a low table. There is a pile of clay tags, each small enough to fit in the palm, each meant to label something larger. A priest or administrator speaks quietly, and the scribe writes. The words are calm, but you can feel the weight of the transaction. When a temple accepts an offering, it also accepts a relationship. Someone gives. The temple receives. The temple remembers. Archaeology suggests that temples accumulate wealth and influence, and that their records can capture a broad web of contexts. That includes local villages, work crews, and sometimes foreign visitors. One interpretation is that foreign goods entering a temple can reveal diplomatic contact as much as trade. A rare stone bead might be a purchase, or it might be a gift meant to open a door. A carved vessel might be a luxury item, or it might be a signal, a polite way of saying, "We exist and we can be useful to each other." A careful reading might suggest that temple inventories sometimes include items that feel out of place, either because the material is exotic or the style is unfamiliar. The record itself is often blunt, naming the object and its quantity, not telling you the social drama behind it. Yet the drama may be there, hidden in plain sight. A temple does not list an item because it is thrilling. It lists it because it matters in the system. You watch a porter carry in a jar sealed with clay. The seal impression is different from the local ones, sharper in its lines, with an animal that does not look like the usual temple motifs. Someone checks the seal, nods, and the jar is moved into storage. The scribe marks it down. A foreign seal in a temple storehouse is a small moment, but small moments are how contact becomes real. Most historians agree that seals and sealings are fundamental to administration, and that seal imagery can vary by region and tradition. One interpretation is that the presence of foreign seal impressions might support the idea of visiting merchants or envoys, people who carry not only goods but identity. This is suggestive, not conclusive. Objects can travel without their owners, and seals can be copied. Still, the temple setting makes it interesting, because temples are not only marketplaces, they are also prestige spaces. If a foreign group wants recognition, bringing gifts to a temple is a smart move. Even the gods love a good networking opportunity. Now you hear a priest speak a title, a formal designation for someone connected to the offering. The title sounds slightly unusual, as if the scribe has to decide how to render it. Titles matter because they reveal roles. A careful reading might suggest that foreign titles appearing in administrative contexts can hint at structured leadership beyond the city, even if that leadership is not described in detail. This is where the idea of a civilization mentioned only in Sumerian records can sit safely, not as a secret empire, but as a structured community with leaders and protocols, known indirectly through its interactions. Historians still argue whether foreign presences in temple records reflect sustained contact or occasional high-status visits that leave an outsized trace in the archive. That debate shapes the story. If contact is sustained, you expect patterns, repeated goods, repeated names, repeated titles. If contact is occasional, you expect spikes, singular items, and brief mentions that feel almost accidental. Either way, a single entry can be the tip of something larger that does not survive elsewhere. You step deeper into the temple complex, where a larger room holds offerings laid out for ritual. The lamps cast a warm glow over polished stone and woven baskets. You see stacks of bread, small bowls of oil, and flowers tied into simple bundles. This is the mainstream ground. Temples coordinate ritual and redistribution. They track offerings. They keep records. That is broadly accepted. The mist begins when you notice that some offerings are labeled as foreign, and the foreignness is treated as meaningful. One interpretation is that foreign goods have value not just because they are rare, but because they are proof of connection. A temple that receives a gift from beyond the horizon becomes a temple with influence. Influence attracts more gifts. Gifts become a feedback loop. The temple is a node in the network. You hear murmurs in a corridor. A group of visitors arrives. They wear clothing that looks slightly different, their hair arranged in a different way, their jewelry catching the lamplight in unfamiliar shapes. You do not pretend you can identify their origin with certainty. You're simply noticing difference, as ancient scribes might. Difference is how the mind categorizes the world. A scribe approaches them with a clay tag and a stylus, and a translator, maybe, or someone who speaks both tongues, stands nearby. The visitors offer small items, not huge cargo, but curated gifts, the kind you carry to make an impression. A finely worked bead, a carved piece of stone, a jar of something fragrant. The temple officials accept with smooth politeness, and the scribe marks down the details. The evidence we do have points to temples interacting with a range of communities. And it is possible that some foreign visitors belong to societies whose own written records do not survive in durable form. That is not dramatic. It is practical. Preservation is uneven. Materials differ. Archives burn, flood, or get dismantled. Clay tablets can survive where papyrus or wood does not. Now, the cinematic layer can enter gently. What if one of these visitors comes from a Nile-adjacent society that is organized, proud, and old in its own way, yet not preserved in its own lasting documents? They might have their own rituals, their own sacred spaces, their own ways of marking ownership, perhaps on perishable materials. They might be in a formative phase, not yet the Egypt of monumental stone, but already something coherent. And what if their only durable trace is the moment they step into a Mesopotamian temple and hand over a gift, prompting a scribe to write a name and a title? You keep your language careful. That is a possibility, not a certainty. We are not proving anything tonight. We are following clues. The mystery is not in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. A fringe idea proposes that temples sometimes act as gateways for foreign cults or foreign gods, and that the appearance of certain unusual offerings might reflect spiritual exchange as well as economic exchange. This theory isn't widely accepted in a sweeping form, but there are mainstream discussions about how religious ideas and symbols can travel along trade networks, if we treat the more dramatic versions as possibility rather than conclusion. The calmer point remains. Temples are hubs, and hubs receive not only objects, but ideas. You watch a priest sprinkle water over an offering and speak a short invocation. The words are not for you. They are for the divine. Yet the act also has a social function. It formalizes the exchange. It makes the gift part of the temple's story. Once it is in the record, it belongs to the institution, and by extension, to the city's memory. A careful reading might suggest that a temple archive is not neutral. It reflects what the temple cares about. If the temple records a foreign item, it may be because the item carries status, novelty, or significance. That can distort perception. A single foreign gift might be recorded meticulously, while everyday foreign trade might be handled more casually or by different offices whose records do not survive. The archive is not the whole world. It is a window, and windows frame what you see. You move into a storage room lined with shelves. Jars are stacked, baskets are labeled, and clay tags hang from cords. The tags fascinate you because they are so small, and yet they can carry a whole geography. A tag can say, in a few marks, that this jar comes from a distant land. That land might be a place you can point to, or a region, or a trade sphere. The scribe is turning distance into a manageable concept. Here comes a soft joke, because even sacred spaces benefit from a little humor. Imagine being a god and receiving endless offerings, and the humans still insist on labeling everything like it is a supermarket aisle. Divine Shelf 3, aromatic resins, imported. The gods must be very patient. Now the temple officials begin to distribute rations to workers. Bread, beer, oil. Names are called. Quantities are measured. The scribe records again. This is where you see the engine. Offerings come in, rations go out, labor continues, canals get dredged, fields get planted, and the city keeps functioning. Foreign contacts are not a separate story. They are part of the same machine. One interpretation is that when a foreign society interacts with this machine, it becomes visible in the records because the machine requires labels. If the foreign society does not have a comparable surviving machine of record-keeping in durable form, it may appear only on this side of the exchange. That can create the illusion that it exists only in Sumerian text, when it may have existed robustly in its own landscape. Historians still argue whether the rarity of certain foreign mentions reflects actual rarity of contact, or simply the selective survival of texts and archives. That debate keeps you humble. It reminds you that absence of mentions can be a preservation issue, not a historical void. A careful reading might suggest that some foreign design elements in offerings, such as shapes of vessels or patterns on seals, could hint at particular cultural zones. This might support the idea of contacts edging toward the Nile world, depending on the specific object and context, but you do not make it sound like a solved puzzle. It is suggestive, not conclusive. Similar designs can arise independently, and objects can travel through many hands. The sky outside begins to lighten. Dawn approaches. Temple lamps feel less necessary as the first gray light slips into corridors. The visitors, if they are still here, prepare to leave. They have done what they came to do. They have delivered gifts. They have gained access, goodwill, or trade terms. They will carry back their own stories about this temple, this city, these rituals. Those stories might be told around their own fires, in their own language, and then disappear into time. You stand in the doorway and let that thought settle. There is something quietly moving about a civilization that might have spoken and sung and negotiated and prayed, yet left its durable written trace mostly in someone else's archive. It is not a tragedy so much as a reminder. History is not a fair recorder. It keeps what survives, not what deserves to survive. A final light joke drifts in, as gentle as the dawn. If you ever feel like your life is not properly documented, just remember that some entire communities got reduced to foreign jar. One unit. Perspective is a powerful sedative. You breathe slowly as the temple wakes fully. The courtyard fills with soft footsteps. The scribes continue their work. The gods, presumably, remain unimpressed, as gods tend to be, and you carry forward a calm, careful idea. What's broadly accepted is that temples record offerings and interactions in meticulous detail. One interpretation is that foreign goods and titles in these records can hint at organized societies beyond Mesopotamia, including ones whose own texts may not have survived. And in the gentle what-if imagination layer, you picture a Nile-adjacent community stepping briefly into the light of a Mesopotamian archive, leaving a name pressed into clay, then returning to the silence of its own landscape. You climb to a rooftop where the city sounds fall away into a low murmur, like the whole place is breathing in its sleep. The roof is flat and cool beneath your feet, and a small brazier glows gently beside a man with a reed stylus tucked behind his ear. He looks up at the sky as if it is a ledger, and tonight, in his mind, it probably is. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamians pay close attention to the heavens, developing traditions of observation that later become deeply influential in the region. The evidence we do have points to calendars and timing being central to agriculture, ritual, and administration. When you live by rivers that flood and fields that need planting, the sky becomes a clock you cannot ignore. You can feel that practical urgency, even now. Standing under stars that look unbothered by human schedules, the observer beside you keeps his gaze steady. He is not doing astrology in the modern pop sense. He is doing timing. He's trying to anchor months and festivals, to keep rituals aligned with seasons, and to ensure that the temple does not announce a celebration when everyone is busy harvesting. That would be awkward. It is possible that, in the earliest phases, observation and interpretation sit side by side, with practical needs driving the work and symbolic meaning growing around it like ivy on a wall. A careful reading might suggest that calendar systems can reveal contact between cultures, not because anyone writes. We learned this from them, but because the timing of festivals, the naming of months, or the choice of reference stars can show patterns. Yet this is delicate territory. Similar solutions can arise independently. Farmers on different rivers can look at the same sky and come to similar conclusions, so you keep your language soft. This might support the idea of shared knowledge. But it is not conclusive. The man beside you gestures toward a cluster of stars and murmurs a name for it, a name you do not fully catch. The names of stars can be stable, but they can also shift through translation, much like place names. The evidence we do have points to the long life of certain celestial traditions, and to the way scribes can preserve them in writing. But early on, much is oral, taught from teacher to student, repeated and refined over years. One interpretation is that if a distant society is in contact with Mesopotamia, even indirectly, some elements of timing and ritual alignment might travel along the same routes as goods. A merchant brings copper and also mentions how his people mark the new year. A visiting envoy attends a festival and observes the sequence. A craftsman hears a month name and repeats it at home. None of this requires conquest or domination. It requires curiosity and conversation. The two most underestimated forces in history. You sit near the brazier and feel the warmth on your hands. The wind up here is cooler, carrying the smell of river water and distant cooking fires. Below, the city's canals reflect starlight in broken lines. The sky feels larger than the city, which is exactly the point. The city wants to control time, but time is not interested in being controlled. Archaeology suggests that early complex societies develop calendars to coordinate labor and ritual, and the evidence we do have points to such calendars being deeply tied to temple life. That is mainstream. The mystery enters when you consider how two different river worlds, Mesopotamia and the Nile sphere, both depend on seasonal rhythms and might, in some periods, brush against each other in trade or diplomacy. One interpretation is that if contact occurs, there could be subtle alignments or echoes in how time is talked about, without leaving a clear paper trail. You hear a temple horn in the distance, a low note that seems to flatten the air for a moment. The observer marks something on a small tablet or board, and his expression remains calm. He is not thinking about mystery theories. He is thinking about whether the barley will be planted on time and whether the festival will happen when the moon says it should. That calm practicality is a reminder. If a clue exists, it may hide in routine. Now your mind drifts to the idea of star names as potential directions. A tempting thought. Some people love the idea that ancient scribes hid maps in celestial language, that a star name is secretly a place name, that a constellation points to a coast. A fringe idea proposes that certain star or month names might encode travel knowledge, like a poetic guidebook. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is often thin. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a way to notice how humans weave meaning into the sky. A more cautious explanation could be that star names reflect myth, farming cues and ritual cycles, not secret navigation. Still, even without secret codes, the sky can be a shared reference point. Two cultures can synchronize conversation if they both understand the moon, the solstices, and the timing of the bright stars. You watch the observer take a slow breath and speak a date, likely in the language of his calendar. Something like the month when this rises, or the time when that sets. The scribe nearby, maybe his assistant, writes it down. The act of writing turns the sky into record. The record turns the sky into authority, and authority turns ritual into coordination. Historians still argue whether early calendar alignment across regions reflects direct cultural contact or parallel development driven by shared environmental needs. That debate is crucial here. If you see similarities, they could be borrowed or simply convergent. Humans are very good at inventing the same tool when faced with the same problem, especially when the tool is as obvious as count the moon. Now you let the cinematic layer soften in. What if, somewhere near the Nile, there is a community not yet monumental in stone, but already deeply attentive to river timing, to star risings, to seasonal winds? They might have their own sacred days, their own way of naming the sky, their own way of deciding when leaders are renewed or rituals begin. And what if, through trade links or diplomatic visits, a few of those timing ideas drift into Mesopotamian awareness, not as a dramatic revelation, but as casual remarks that scribes gradually absorb? You do not claim that a Sumerian scribe writes down Nile calendar secrets. You claim something gentler. It's possible that subtle echoes of context show up in the shared human task of managing time, and that such echoes are easy to overread. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The observer points toward the horizon where the faintest light begins to gather. He watches for a rising. Your own eyes squint, sleepy, trying to make out the shift. A bright star or planet might appear, and with it, a marker. In some traditions, the rising of certain stars becomes associated with seasonal change. Archaeology suggests that different cultures notice these patterns, and the evidence we do have points to star risings being used as cues in various ancient contexts. Yet identifying precise cross-cultural links from early periods can be difficult. That is why you stay cautious. A small, gentle joke comes in as you keep squinting. Ancient astronomy is like trying to read tiny print on a receipt in bad lighting. You know it matters, but your eyes are offended. At least the stars do not charge late fees. The observer makes another mark. He seems satisfied. Below, the city begins to stir. You hear distant footsteps, the creak of a door, the soft clatter of pottery. Dawn is a reset, and calendars are built on resets. The daily cycle mirrors the yearly cycle. Start Count. Align. Repeat. Now you consider how a civilization mentioned only in Mesopotamian records might show up in a timekeeping context, not as a named empire, but as a foreign festival day, a borrowed ritual timing, a mention of a distant group arriving for a ceremony at a certain time of Yule. One interpretation is that visiting traders might time their arrivals to match festivals, because festivals are when the city is in a giving mood, and also when the temples are busy, and busy temples move goods. This is a practical motive that can produce repeated patterns. If a distant group appears repeatedly around a festival season, the record might preserve their presence, even if their own records do not survive. You keep your attention on the human side. The observer is not a mystic in a dramatic robe. He is a worker. His job is to keep the system aligned. That system includes agriculture, labor schedules, and ritual authority. If foreign contact touches any part of that system, it might leave a mark in the calendar logic, not because anyone intends it, but because systems absorb what is useful. A careful reading might suggest that differences in how months are named or how intercalation is handled, adding extra time to keep seasons aligned, can hint at the sophistication of a calendar tradition. Yet drawing direct lines from one culture to another requires caution. The evidence we do have is often later, and the early layers can be hard to isolate. Scholars continue to debate how far back certain traditions reach, and how much change happens over time. A fringe idea proposes that early sky lore preserves memories of disasters or conflicts, with strange star names acting like metaphors for upheaval. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it shows how strongly humans want the sky to be a storybook. A more cautious explanation could be that mythic language arises naturally, giving emotional texture to predictable cycles. Still, myths can sometimes preserve faint historical echoes, and the challenge is separating echo from invention. You watch the first true band of dawn color spread across the horizon, pale and calm. The observer relaxes, as if a burden has been set down. He has done his job. Time will make sense again for another day. You stand on the rooftop and let the cool air settle your thoughts. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian societies pay close attention to the sky and develop calendar systems tied to temple and agriculture. One interpretation is that contact with distant societies could, in subtle ways, influence ritual timing or shared observational habits, though parallel development is also likely. And in the gentle what-if imagination layer, you picture a Nile-adjacent community watching the same sky, counting the same moons, speaking different star names into the night, and leaving behind only the faintest trace of that shared timing in the records of a city far to the east. A last light joke floats in as the sun threatens to show its face. If you are ever late to something, just remember that ancient scribes could blame the moon. Sorry, my calendar needed adjustment. Honestly, a classic excuse. The rooftop grows brighter. The stars fade one by one, not because they are gone, but because the day refuses to share attention. You take a slow breath, letting the warmth of coming morning ease into your shoulders, and you keep the puzzle where it belongs, calm, open, and gently unresolved. You walk into a room where stories live, not as entertainment, but as equipment. The walls are thick, the air is cool, and a low lamp makes the clay tablets glow as if they have their own inner heat. A storyteller sits on a woven mat, surrounded by listeners who look tired in the satisfying way that says the day has been long and the night is welcome. The storyteller's voice is low and steady, the kind of voice that makes your shoulders loosen without asking permission. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myths and epics preserve cultural values and sometimes echo real places. real concerns, and real events, even when the stories are wrapped in symbolic drama. The evidence we do have points to a world where oral tradition and written tradition blend, with scribes eventually writing down narratives that have lived in speech for a long time. That mix is important because it means a story can carry a memory for centuries, but also reshape that memory into something meaningful rather than literal. The storyteller begins with a phrase that signals a shift, a move from daily life into the realm where gods and kings and strange lands can all share the same stage. You listen, and you realize the room itself is a kind of temple, not for a god, but for imagination. And imagination is powerful, especially when your evidence is incomplete. One interpretation is that myths sometimes act like containers for geography. A land can be described as distant, rich, blessed, dangerous, or pure, and those descriptors can hint at real regions experienced through trade and travel. Yet the story does not care about your modern map. The story cares about meaning. If a land represents abundance, it will be described as abundant, even if the real place has mosquitoes and awkward taxes like every other place. The storyteller speaks of a far-off land where things are better, water is sweeter, or riches come easily. The listeners sigh softly, because everyone loves the idea that somewhere else life is simpler. A careful reading might suggest that such lands of beginnings or lands of blessing could be tied to real trading zones that feel exotic to city dwellers. But here is the caution. A land in myth can be a metaphor for order, purity, or divine favor. It can be less a location and more a psychological direction. Historians still argue whether specific mythic lands correspond to identifiable real-world locations or function primarily as symbolic spaces. That debate sits right at the heart of tonight's balance. We want the mystery, but we do not want to pretend it is documentary film. The solid ground is that myths exist and sometimes include place names. The mist is how literal those names are. The cinematic layer is how it feels to walk into the myth and look around. The storyteller's voice deepens and describes a journey. A hero or king travels, meets strange beings, receives gifts, or faces tests. The journey is not always a literal itinerary. It can be a pattern, a ritual of transformation. Yet journeys can include details that feel oddly practical, like routes across water, descriptions of foreign goods, or mentions of distant ports. Archaeology suggests that trade brings foreign materials into Mesopotamia, and the evidence we do have points to those materials becoming part of the imaginative world of stories. If you have seen lapis in real life, you can dream about lapis with more confidence. You notice that certain lands in the story are described in ways that overlap with how merchants talk. A place is known for a certain resource. A place is associated with ships or metal. A place feels like it sits at the edge of the world. One interpretation is that myth borrows the vocabulary of trade because trade is how the city experiences the wider world. The city dreams with the ingredients it has. Now, the mystery portion enters with a soft step. A popular rumor claims that ancient myths encode hidden histories, including mentions of civilizations older than the famous ones. Civilizations erased from the record but preserved in story form. This rumor is not widely accepted, and it often becomes too confident too quickly. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a thoughtful prompt. Myths can preserve faint echoes, but they also invent, exaggerate, and symbolize. A more cautious explanation could be that myths blend real geography with moral storytelling. A far land might be inspired by trade contact, but reshaped into a mythic stage. The story's purpose is to teach to entertain, to reinforce identity, or to express anxiety about the unknown. That anxiety is especially relevant when the story mentions foreignness. The storyteller mentions foreign people in a way that is both curious and cautious. They are admired for their goods, but also treated as mysterious. That feeling is timeless. Foreignness can be alluring and unsettling at the same time. One interpretation is that this emotional mix can cause a story to preserve certain foreign names more vividly than an administrative record does, because the story attaches feelings to the name. A place name in a myth can survive because it is exciting, not because it is important economically. You let your mind settle into the room's rhythm. The lamp crackles softly. Someone shifts on the mat. The storyteller's hands move, painting shapes in the air. You think about the possibility that a Nile-adjacent civilization, or a community near the roots that brush the Nile sphere, might appear in these stories as a distant land of beginnings, or as a place where important goods come from. If so, it would not be a clear label. It would be a dream label, a story label, a symbolic label. This is where the truth ladder keeps you safe. Documented is that the myths exist and include lands and journeys. Interpreted is that some lands might reflect trade knowledge or geography. Imagined is you stepping into the myth as if it is a map. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The storyteller shifts to a theme of order and chaos, a common ancient concern. Cities rely on order. Rivers can bring chaos. Foreignness can feel like chaos. The gods themselves often represent forces that must be negotiated. In such a worldview, a far-off civilization can become a symbol, even if it is also real. A careful reading might suggest that when a story describes a land as pure or ancient, it might be projecting a longing for stability or origin, not describing an actual early kingdom. You hear a line about a sacred place, a place where beginnings happen, and the listeners grow quiet. Everyone wants to know where beginnings come from. That desire can create mystery on its own. One interpretation is that this desire can cause later audiences to read myths as history, because history feels like it should have a single starting point. But real beginnings are messy. Real beginnings are overlapping communities, experiments in living, and gradual change. A gentle joke slips in as you consider this. Humans love origin stories so much that we would probably demand an origin story for bread if someone did not give us one. Who invented toast is the kind of question that could start a war in the right group chat. The storyteller describes an encounter with the divine, and the language becomes more symbolic. In this moment, it is tempting to imagine that the myth is secretly describing an actual diplomatic meeting, perhaps between Mesopotamians and a distant Nile-leaning society. A fringe idea proposes that divine meetings in myths are coded accounts of foreign emissaries or elite exchanges. With gods standing in for powerful outsiders, this theory isn't widely accepted, but it can be entertained as a possibility rather than a conclusion. A more cautious explanation could be that divine encounters are a storytelling tool for expressing awe, authority, and the limits of human power. You listen as the story moves to gifts. Gifts matter in both myth and politics. A gift can create obligation. A gift can signal status. A gift can open trade. Archaeology suggests that gift exchange is a real social practice in many ancient contexts. And the evidence we do have points to luxury goods moving as both trade items and prestige items. One interpretation is that myths emphasize gifts because gifts are emotionally charged. They turn relationships into visible objects. Now imagine, gently, a scene. A messenger arrives from a distant river world. He brings a carved object, a rare scent, a stone that does not belong to Mesopotamian earth. The palace receives it. The temple blesses it. The scribes record it, and the storytellers later fold it into a narrative, calling the giver a divine emissary or naming the land with a poetic label. This is imagined, not documented. It is a cinematic possibility meant to keep you curious, not to convince you of certainty. Historians still argue whether the overlap between mythic motifs and archaeological realities indicates preserved memory or repeated symbolic patterns that appear independently across cultures. That debate keeps the mystery honest. If you hear a myth about a flood, it might echo real flooding, or it might be a universal story about renewal and loss. If you hear about a far land of abundance, it might echo a real trade destination, or it might be a universal fantasy. Both can be true in different ways. The storyteller's tale shifts again. And you notice how place names in myth often function like characters. They are not neutral. They have personality. A land is generous. A land is hostile. A land is ancient. A land is blessed. This is how stories keep attention. Yet it also means the land is being shaped to serve the story. So if a Nile-adjacent civilization appears here, it may appear as a mood rather than a coordinate. You keep the question gentle. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if a poetic land in a Mesopotamian narrative carries a faint echo of a real community near northeastern Africa, known indirectly through trade, admired for certain goods, and then mythologized? The mystery is not in proving it. The mystery is in tracing how humans turned contact into legend. A second soft joke arrives as the room gets quieter. If you have ever heard someone exaggerate a travel story after one weekend trip, you know exactly how myths happen. I went to the market becomes I journeyed to the edge of the world. Honestly, same energy. The lamp burns lower. The storyteller's voice slows. The listeners' heads begin to tilt. Sleep pulling them gently. You feel that pull too, and you leave the room with a calm understanding. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian myths weave together symbolic drama and hints of the wider world. One interpretation is that some mythic lands may reflect trade knowledge or geographic memory, though symbolism and convergence are also strong. And in the gentle what-if imagination layer, you picture a civilization near the Nile sphere becoming a poetic name in a Sumerian story. Not because it is hidden, but because stories transform whatever they touch. You step back into the night air. The city is quieter now. The mystery remains open, like a door left slightly ajar, not to scare you, but to let in a breeze of curiosity as you drift toward sleep. You stand where land cannot decide if it is land. Under your feet, the ground is soft and layered, a living sandwich of silt, reeds, and old river moods. The air smells wet, earthy, and faintly salty, like the world has been rinsed and set out to dry. A wide sky hangs overhead, pale with morning haze, and the horizon is a blur where water becomes marsh. Marsh becomes sand, and sand becomes whatever it feels like today. Most historians agree that rivers are both builders and erasers. They feed fields, support cities, and carry trade. But they also flood, shift channels, bury walls, and scatter objects in ways that make later reconstruction difficult. The evidence we do have points to settlements rising where water is reliable, then vanishing when water changes its mind. That process is not dramatic the way a movie wants. It is slow, stubborn, and relentless. Like a bureaucracy made of mud, you walk along a low embankment with a small group of searchers. Not treasure hunters with dramatic hats, but practical people with baskets, notebooks, and the kind of patience that can stare at dirt without getting insulted. They move carefully, scanning the ground. A broken potsherd is picked up, turned, examined, and set aside. A small stone bead is found, and everyone gets quieter, because small things can be big clues in places like this. Archaeology suggests that in river deltas and floodplains, preservation can be complicated. Organic materials can decay quickly. Wooden structures can rot. Reeds and textiles can vanish. Even mud brick, which seems sturdy, can melt back into the landscape when water and time cooperate. Meanwhile, small durable objects can survive and travel, carried by currents, dredging, animal hooves, or human hands. One interpretation is that some missing civilizations might not be missing at all. They might be submerged, buried, dissolved, or scattered into fields far from their original streets. You look down at the river water sliding past, and you imagine it as a slow conveyor belt. A flood arrives, lifts debris, moves it, drops it somewhere else. Then the channel shifts, leaving the former riverbed as a dry scar that later becomes farmland. People plow, they find artifacts. They toss some aside, they keep others. A careful reading might suggest that a civilization can be reduced, over millennia, into a thin smear of objects spread across miles. If you expect neat ruins, you miss it. If you learn to read the smear, you might glimpse it. Now the mystery of tonight's premise becomes physically plausible in a very calm way. If a Nile-adjacent society is mentioned only in Sumerian records, one reason could be that its own written archives never survive, especially if they are on perishable material stored in damp places. Another reason could be that its settlements lie beneath layers of silt that later communities build over, or that the coastline it used has changed, leaving former ports inland or underwater. These are not sensational ideas. They are the normal unfairness of geology. You follow a narrow path between reeds, and insects rise and settle like tiny drifting punctuation. Someone points toward a low mound in the distance, barely higher than the surrounding ground. The mound does not scream city. It whispers, maybe. You approach it and see a scatter of broken pottery on the surface. The shards have different textures, different thicknesses. Some look local to this landscape. Others look unfamiliar, not alien, just different enough to make you pause. A careful reading might suggest that differences in pottery style can indicate trade contact, cultural exchange, or shifting populations. But it can also reflect local experimentation, so you keep it gentle. It's possible these shards represent multiple communities using the same spot over time. It's possible they represent a meeting place, a small port, a seasonal camp, or a settlement that never grew into monumental stone. And in a delta, even a significant settlement can look like almost nothing above ground. A small excavation trench is open near the mound. The soil is dark, damp, and layered. Each layer is a page, and the pages are messy. You watch as trowels scrape carefully, lifting thin slices of earth. A fragment of fired clay appears, then another, then something else. A small lump of clay with an impression on it, a seal impression. It sits in a palm, tiny and powerful, like a fingerprint from a person who never knew fingerprints would matter. The impression shows an animal and a border pattern. The style feels a little different from what the local team expects here. Not wildly different, just enough to raise the quiet question, did this come from a person who lived here, or from a person passing through? Most historians agree that seals and sealings are tools of identity and administration, and that they can travel with people and goods. The evidence we do have points to seals being used to secure containers, mark ownership, and formalize transactions. One interpretation is that finding ceilings in unexpected places can hint at networks of exchange that cross regions. This might support the idea that a community here participates in wider systems, even if its own archives have not survived. But you do not jump. You do not turn one ceiling into a whole empire. You let it be what it is, a durable clue that asks for context. Now another ceiling appears. Broken, partial, then another, and then a small cluster, scattered through a layer that suggests disturbance. Maybe flood deposition, maybe later activity. The objects are not neatly stored like a library. They are in the wrong place for neatness. And that wrongness is interesting. This is the new development that keeps your sleepy mind awake in a gentle way. The clue is not a buried palace. The clue is a scatter. A careful reading might suggest that a scatter of broken ceilings could come from many scenarios. A storage area could be destroyed and washed out. A dumping spot could have been used to discard ceilings after containers were opened. A workshop might have processed goods and tossed the clay bits aside. Or later people could have dug into older layers and mixed materials unintentionally. The evidence we do have points to floods and human activity both being capable of mixing layers, creating puzzles that look like riddles but are sometimes just mess. Historians still argue whether artifact scatters in floodplain contexts reflect original activity areas or secondary deposition caused by water movement and later disturbance. That debate matters because it decides whether you are looking at a place where people once worked, or at a place where the river dumped the leftovers of somewhere else. You breathe slowly and watch the team map the finds. Strings mark a grid. Notes are taken. The work is careful, almost meditative. In a way, archaeology can be bedtime friendly because it is the opposite of rushing. It rewards slow attention. It rewards calm. Now the mind's cinematic layer drifts in, clearly labeled as possibility. What if these ceilings represent goods arriving from a distant community? One that sits near the Nile sphere or along corridors that connect to it. What if that community is organized enough to use seals routinely, yet its own archives do not survive in durable materials? The ceilings reach this delta through trade. The containers are opened. The clay is discarded. Then a flood spreads the fragments like confetti no one asked for. Centuries later, you find them in the wrong sand. That is a possibility, not a certainty. A more cautious explanation could be that the seal style is from a known nearby tradition, or that it is a local variant, or that it belongs to travelers from many places. Not a single lost society. Still, the scatter keeps the question alive. It suggests contact, movement, and administrative habits beyond a simple village economy. A soft joke slips in as you watch someone carefully bag a fragment smaller than a cookie crumb. Imagine explaining this to a modern friend. Yes, I flew across the world to pick up broken clay bits the size of a fingernail. Your friend nods politely and then asks if you need a nap. The answer is always yes. The trench deepens. A darker layer appears, rich with organic material, like an old marsh surface. Then a thin band of clean silt sits on top of it, like a blanket laid down by water. Flood layer. You can almost feel the event without seeing it. Not a movie flood, not a roaring wall of destruction, but a steady rise that covers, deposits, and retreats, leaving a new ground level. A settlement can be buried this way in a single season, then rebuilt over, then buried again. Over centuries, the ground rises, and old streets become a secret basement under the living world. Archaeology suggests that repeated flooding and silt deposition can create deep stratigraphy in river valleys and deltas. The evidence we do have points to many ancient sites being deeply buried, requiring either extensive excavation or lucky exposure to be found. One interpretation is that a civilization could leave substantial remains, yet still be invisible to surface survey in a heavily silted region. It's possible that the physical city is there, but it sits under meters of quiet. You step back and look across the marshy plain. It feels endless. You realize how many places could hide under this landscape, not because they're hidden on a purpose, but because the earth keeps rewriting the surface. This is where mystery becomes humble. The mystery is not a secret door. The mystery is a thick layer of mud. A fringe idea proposes that some ancient deltas conceal entire drowned districts, like underwater neighborhoods preserved in pockets, waiting for discovery with modern methods. This theory isn't widely accepted in the dramatic sense, and evidence varies by region. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it encourages a calm thought. Changing coastlines and rising water can move the boundary between land and sea, potentially covering ancient activity areas. A more cautious explanation could be that most structures in such zones are degraded, not perfectly preserved, and that finding them is difficult and uncertain. You keep walking. The team pauses by a shallow channel where water trickles. On the bank, someone spots a shard of stone that looks worked. It is not a statue, not a monument, just a shaped piece that could have been part of a tool or ornament. The object is recorded and bagged. Small, small, small. That is how this landscape speaks. One interpretation is that the only in Sumerian records civilization might be one of these small speaking landscapes, a culture that leaves thin but real traces, while Mesopotamian clay archives preserve its name more loudly. The unevenness of survival can create a strange imbalance. One region shouts through tablets, another murmurs through scattered fragments. Both can be real. A second gentle joke arrives as you step around a patch of mud that looks innocent but is absolutely a trap. Ancient deltas and modern sidewalks share a common goal. They want at least one of your shoes. You tiptoe like a cautious heron and keep your dignity. Mostly. As the day warms, the air becomes heavier and the insects get more confident. The team packs up some finds and lays them out under shade. You see a handful of seal impressions, some broken, some clear enough to show details. You notice that a few impressions share motifs, suggesting they might belong to a limited set of seal owners or workshops. That pattern matters because patterns can imply organization. Organization can imply a structured community or administrative habits. Still, you keep the ladder in mind. Documented. The ceilings exist in the ground. Interpreted. What they indicate about networks and origins. Imagined. The scene of distant traders and lost archives. Some parts are documented. Some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. You look at the ceilings again and picture the hands that pressed them. The hand is the most human thing in the whole story. A person rolls a seal over clay, securing a container. They expect the container to travel. They expect someone to receive it. They expect the record to matter. They do not expect you, thousands of years later, staring at the broken result like it is a message in a bottle. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the civilization you seek is not a single grand kingdom, but a web of communities along shifting waters, administratively competent enough to leave ceilings and standardized containers, yet living in an environment that erases archives? In that case, being mentioned only in Sumerian records might not mean it is purely mythical. It might mean its durable voice is missing, while its practical footprints remain scattered. A more cautious explanation could be that the ceilings belong to known regional exchanges and that the missing written record is simply a matter of what has been excavated and what has not. Both can be true in different ways. The evidence we do have points to immense gaps in archaeological coverage, especially in landscapes that are difficult to survey and dig. The sun lowers slightly, and the air shifts. The team closes the trench carefully, covering it like putting a story back to sleep. You take one last look at the mound, the reeds, the water, and the thin line of silt that marks a flood long past. You carry away a calm conclusion that is not really a conclusion, more like a steady posture. What's broadly accepted is that floods, shifting rivers, and silt can bury or scatter settlements and archives, making some societies harder to see than others. One interpretation is that a civilization known through Sumerian mentions could be physically real but archaeologically quiet due to preservation and landscape change. And in the gentle what-if imagination layer, you picture broken ceilings drifting into the wrong sand, the last durable whisper of a community that once lived by water, traded with neighbors, and then slipped, not into legend exactly, but into the long, soft, erasing hands of the river. You sit in a small room where the walls hold warmth from the day and the air holds quiet like a blanket. A single oil lamp burns low, and its flame makes the shadows slow and rounded. Outside, night returns, and the city settles into the soft sounds of distant water. An occasional footstep, a dog that decides to comment once and then goes back to being a dog. Your breath feels easy here. The story has carried you through records, roots, names, temples, skies, myths, and mud. And now the mind wants something simple. Most historians agree that Egypt's rise becomes visible through archaeology and later texts, and that Mesopotamia's early writing offers some of the earliest sustained written windows into complex society. The evidence we do have points to an uneven world of preservation. Clay tablets can last where papyrus and wood often do not. Floodplains can bury cities. Coastal edges can shift. Archives can vanish. What's broadly accepted is not that a single lost civilization is guaranteed, but that the record is patchy enough to leave real room for unanswered questions. One interpretation is that the phrase, a civilization mentioned only in Sumerian records, might describe not a grand hidden empire, but an ordinary human community that simply loses its own durable voice. It could be a network of ports, a cluster of settlements, or a corridor society that connects river worlds through trade. It's possible that Mesopotamian scribes write its name because a system requires labels, while the society's own record-keeping, if it exists, is written on materials that do not survive or stored in places where water and time are unkind. Historians still argue whether the most mysterious ancient place names represent specific fixed locations, shifting trade spheres, or symbolic categories that change with context. That debate is the calm heartbeat behind tonight's mystery. If a name shifts, it can accidentally include multiple communities inside a single label. If a name is symbolic, it can reflect longing or fear rather than geography. If a name is geographic, it can still move when coastlines and routes move. Each option is plausible in some cases, and none of them gives you an easy, clean ending. A careful reading might suggest that the safest way to hold this puzzle is to separate 3 layers in your mind without forcing them to collapse into one. On solid ground, you have early Mesopotamian writing, temple administration, trade networks, and the reality that scribes track foreign goods and foreign names. In the interpretation layer, you have the idea that some of those names could point toward societies nearer the Nile sphere, or toward networks that brush it, even if the exact mapping is debated. In the gentle imagination layer, You have the cinematic picture of a community living by shifting water, organized enough to trade and seal goods, yet leaving few durable texts of its own. You are not proving anything tonight. You are following clues. The mystery is not in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. That kind of honesty is not boring. It is soothing. It lets the mind rest without feeling tricked. Now the lamp flickers, and you focus on the simplest image of all. A scribe presses a stylus into clay. The mark is small, the mark is deliberate. The mark outlives empires. This is why Sumerian records can sometimes feel like the only voice in the room. They are not the only voice that existed. They are simply the voice that survives loudly. One interpretation is that survival can look like importance, even when it is partly luck. A more cautious explanation could be that chance plays a huge role in what reaches you, and that many histories are still sleeping underground, waiting for a different season, a different dig, or a different accident of preservation. A fringe idea proposes that a single, advanced pre-Egypt civilization influenced multiple regions and then disappeared, leaving only cryptic references. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is often too thin to support strong claims. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it can still be useful. It reminds you to stay curious about gaps, but also to respect the difference between a gap and a hidden answer. A gap is simply an unknown. Sometimes the unknown stays unknown for a long time, and that is not a failure. That is the natural shape of deep time. A gentle joke comes in, soft as the lamplight. Humans love to turn every missing puzzle piece into a dramatic plot twist. Sometimes the plot twist is just that the ancient world did not back up its files. You let the city's night sounds become a kind of rhythm. Water somewhere, a distant murmur, a soft knock of pottery. The same sounds could have existed in many places at many times, including along the Nile and its neighboring corridors. That is one of the calm truths of history. Most people live ordinary lives. They work, trade, eat, argue, laugh, and try to sleep. Great civilizations rise, but daily life is the engine underneath. One interpretation is that when you imagine a lost community, you do not need to imagine a palace first. You can imagine a dock, a granary, a workshop, a row of houses, a shrine with a lamp, and a person sealing a jar for transport. That is enough to be real. That is enough to be remembered indirectly. Even if the community's own words do not survive in the materials you can still read. Now comes the wind down, the slow settling that helps your mind soften around the edges. You take a slow breath and picture a river at night. The water moves without hurrying, reflecting the moon in broken pieces along the bank. Reeds sway with the smallest breeze. Somewhere nearby, a small settlement rests, not loud, not monumental, just present. A few lamps glow in doorways. A boat rocks gently against a post. A dog circles twice and lies down. People sleep with the kind of tiredness you earn from work that involves lifting, carrying, and counting. In one house, someone keeps records in a way that suits their world. Maybe they use ink on a material that will not last. Maybe they tie knots in cords. Maybe they mark tallies on wood. Maybe they simply remember, because memory is also a system. They do not know that far away, in a different city. A scribe will write their land's name into clay because a shipment arrives and needs a label. The name will sit beside numbers and commodities, humble and unglamorous, and that humility will become its strength. It will survive. The river shifts over years and then over centuries. Floods lay down silt-like sheets. Channels move. The shoreline changes its mind. The settlement becomes quieter, then smaller, then gone. Not with drama, just with time. What remains are a few scattered objects, a few seal fragments, a few stubborn shards, and a name in someone else's archive. The solid ground stays solid. People traded, people recorded, landscapes changed. The mist stays mist. Which name meant which place, and which community hid inside which label. The imagination stays gentle. A face lit by a lamp, a hand pressing a seal, a boat slipping into the dark water. You let that image fade in the kindest way. The lamp in your mind burns lower. The sounds soften. The questions do not need to be answered tonight. They can simply exist, like stars you do not name but still see. Your breathing slows, your shoulders loosen. The river keeps moving, and your thoughts can drift with it, calm and unafraid, letting mystery be a quiet companion rather than a loud demand. End of script. Sweet dreams.